Leadership Training Series. Today we'll be having a training on advanced land use and zoning. Many of you throughout the years have been able to take Land Use and Zoning 101 or Introductory Land Use and Zoning or the Basics of Land Use and Zoning, or have seen the videos and PowerPoint on this topic. This is meant as a follow-up to that training, and we're very happy to be joined by over 100 individuals, actually 61 as of now, over 100 individuals registered to take this training. I would like to thank Elka Moretti from our office for continuing to provide coordination around the Community Board Leadership Training Series. So thank you, Elka. And I'd like to thank our presenter today, who's also the director of the Office of Manhattan Borough President's Land Use Division, Lisette Chaparro. So thank you, Lisette, for joining us. So today's facilitator trainer will be Lisette Chaparro, who currently serves as the Director of Land Use for the Manhattan Borough President's Office. In that role, she advises the Borough President on a wide range of planning issues and helps to support Manhattan's 12 community districts on matters related to land use, historic preservation, and construction. Prior to joining the MBPO, Lisette worked for not-for-profit affordable housing developers in Hell's Kitchen and in East Harlem. In these roles, she managed construction projects, resident engagement initiatives, and conducted outreach to stakeholders and advocacy groups on large-scale developments and zoning projects. These projects included the redevelopment plan for the Port Authority Bus Terminal and the 2018 zoning text amendment for the Special Garment Center District. Lisette graduated from Brown University with a BA in Urban Studies and received an MA in City and Regional Planning from Rutgers University. So without further ado, thank you, Lisette, for leading this training on advanced land use and zoning for our office. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aldrin, for the intro. And thank you for everyone who has called into tonight's webinar. As Aldrin mentioned, my name is Lisette. I am the Director of Land Use for the Manhattan Borough President's Office. In this training, we'll be talking about some very in-depth land use topics. So let's get into the agenda for tonight. So we will be doing a overview of the Land Use 101 training, even though it's a prerequisite for this webinar. We just want everyone to be on the same page. I know some folks who have called in were certainly at last week's Land Use 101, so hopefully it'll be a good refresher for everyone. We'll talk about zoning calculations, incentive zoning, landmarks and zoning, special permits, and then we'll also finish off with a conversation about large-scale developments. So just to go over the concept of land use in general, this is essentially the idea that you can dictate what happens, what uses can take place on a particular parcel. So the map that you see in front of you right now is a map of Lower Manhattan. The colors are the customary colors that you would see in any land use map. We have yellow for residential uses, mixed use in orange, commercial in red, parks, of course, in green. Institutions and facilities are usually in blue, transportation and parking in gray, manufacturing uses in purple, and of course we've got vacant lots. I just want to pause for a minute. There was one detail I forgot to add. I will be stopping for questions. I will stop at the end of sections 2, 4, and 6. You can write any questions that you have throughout the presentation or while I'm taking questions, and I will be sure to get to them. But just in the interest of getting through this lengthy presentation, again, we'll stop every other section. Okay. And also we want to talk a little bit about the 1916 and the 1961 zoning resolution. So New York City had the first zoning ordinance in the country in 1916. And this was really about promoting the health and safety of New York residents. There were basic heightened setback controls for development in the city. And there was a basic idea of separating residential uses from other kinds of uses that you wouldn't want next to a residential area, such as manufacturing. The zoning resolution is then overhauled in 1961. One of the major reasons and one of the major advents that happens between 1916 and 1961 is, of course, the vehicle, right? And so the zoning resolution gets overhauled at this point, in part to deal with that, but it also does a number of other things. We are able to establish use groups, which we'll talk about more in detail, and also have bulk regulations that really will shape development that takes place in the city. But still, one of the major things, again, is this idea of health and wellness of residents, and in particular, the right of people in the city to have access to light and air. And that's a theme that we'll sort of see resurfacing as we discuss these various land use topics. Zoning districts, again, just to do an overview. On the right, you have actually an official zoning map of the west side of Manhattan here. It's typically a map that's done in grayscale. We've overlaid it with colors just to show the various districts. Again, residential in yellow, commercial in red, and manufacturing here in purple. These different districts will tell you not just what uses you can have, but will specify what the bulk requirements will be for any properties that are developed in that particular area. We also talked about as of right and discretionary development. The majority of development that happens in the city of New York is as of right, just about 90%. So an as of right development is something that does not require a discretionary approval from a city agency. It does, however, have to submit permits and a job application to the Department of Buildings, and then can sort of proceed with construction from there. That is different from a development that requires a discretionary action, either a rezoning or a development that requires a special permit or a variance. We also have buildings and uses that are considered grandfathered in the city of New York. So when there is a change to the zoning resolution, those changes really apply only to new developments going forward. So what happens with uses and buildings that predate those changes in the zoning resolution is that we call them legally non-conforming and non-complying buildings. We also talked about the different kinds of public review that we have. The big one that you'll hear about most often is ULURP, the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure. These are applications that are referred to the community board, the borough president, the city planning commission, as well as the city council. And this includes some special permits that are granted by the city planning commission, which are found in section 7400 of the zoning resolution. We also have certifications that are granted by the CPC chair. These are usually more minor approvals, and they are referred to the community board for comment. We have zoning authorizations. Again, they're voted on by the City Planning Commission and also referred to by, referred to the community board for comment. And lastly, there is the Board of Standards and Appeals, which sort of acts as the relief valve from the zoning resolution, and they grant variances when it comes to either use or bulk on a particular site. And they grant permits. The permits that they are in charge of granting are all outlined in section 7300 of the zoning resolution. We talked about CEQR, right? So this is the city's way of doing an environmental review for proposed projects. CEQR is a way to disclose what the effects of those projects will be. There's a process through which a scope gets drafted, and the community has a say both in what the scope is, as well as the mitigations, the way that the applicant proposes to address some of the potential adverse effects of their development. We had a graph, this is a bit of a condensed version of it, showing both the CEQR process and how it runs in tandem with ULURP. The CEQR process, again, that we have a scoping process that the public is involved in. There's a public hearing at the point that there is an environmental impact statement. And we also have the ULURP process, right? So we talked about the pre-certification process and finalizing that application, certifying that it's complete, and then kicking it into the public review process with the community board, the borough president's office, the city planning commission, and the city council. And of course, transfer of development rights. We'll go more into detail with a particular example later on in the presentation. But this is generally the idea that to the extent that a building has not maxed out on how much floor area it can build, that building can then transfer that either in most cases to an adjacent property. And then in some cases, we have special provisions for example, landmarks that can transfer them to more different areas and have more flexibility on where they can send their development rights. So I want to talk a little bit about zoning calculations as well. Zoning calculations are essentially what you do to figure out whether your building is as of right or not. One of the major tenets of that is bulk controls. So we have floor area ratio, which we talked about a lot in Land Use 101. There are also open space requirements as well as height and setback requirements. In terms of open space, lots will have a lot coverage requirement, which basically is a percentage of the zoning lot that has to be covered by the building. There's also open space ratios. This is a percent, again, that has to be unobstructed to the sky. So for example, if you have a lot that is 20,000 square feet and an open space ratio of 20, you multiply 20 by 20,000, you end up with 4,000, sorry, 20%, and you end up with 4,000 square feet. That is how much you are required to keep unobstructed to the sky as open space in your development. And we also have yard requirement, usually in residential districts. In medium and high density, you're looking at 30 feet rear yard requirements. Height and setback. This one of the important things to understand when you're talking about height and setback is that we use a terminology of street walls, right? So street wall, if you look at the image to the left, is the facade of the building that rises from the ground level up until you have that front setback. So street walls in general are a way to talk about you know, that continuity that you see when you're walking down a block and all the buildings sort of line up. So you have a continuous street wall in some districts and not in others. We also talk about the base height of a building, right? So the base height is the height that you see up until you have that setback. In some districts, we rely on the sky exposure plane, which is a basic ratio that the sky exposure plane usually begins after a certain base height, but it essentially will tell you it's an invisible plane that your building is not allowed to penetrate. And so it'll dictate sort of multiple setbacks that the building can take as it goes up. And also, I just want to again discuss a little bit about development rights and the different kinds we have. We've got, we could have development rights that are on a site that have different owners, and those are usually noted via a condo regime that is drafted for the property. But there are also development rights that I think is the one that's most commonly understood by folks, which is that you have extra floor area on a site, and if you're not using it all, then you can transfer those development rights to other zoning lots, and we'll talk a little bit more about the different provisions that dictate where those development rights can go and how that mechanism works in particular. And I want to do also an example of how to calculate floor area. So in this example, we have a 30 by 100 foot lot. Your maximum area is going to be the area of your lot multiplied by the floor area ratio. So in this case, we have a 30 foot, a 3,000 foot lot. And we have an FAR of 4.0. So that gives us 12,000 square feet that we can build. If you already had a building on the site, your maximum floor area would be your available floor area would be your maximum floor area minus whatever floor area is already built on the site. I also want to note that in this example, we're looking at a 70% lot coverage requirement, which means that of the 3,000 square feet on this lot, you are able to build on 2,100 square feet. That is the area that is shaded in the image to the left. Let's talk a little bit about different uses within a single site. So in this example, we've got an R6 zoning district that has a commercial overlay. And these are the maximum FAR for commercial, residential, and community facilities. So for commercial, if you were only building commercial, you are limited to 2 FAR. If you were only building residential, you would be able to build up to 2.43 FAR. And that is, if you're just doing commercial and residential, your maximum building FAR would be 2.43. So the third image from the left is an example of development that uses 1 FAR for commercial, and then the remainder for residential. So you max out there at 2.43. However, if you have commercial, residential, and a community facility in an R6 zoning district, then your maximum FAR is 4.8. So again, we see 1 FAR going to commercial, 1.43 going to residential, and the remainder 2.37 FAR for the community facility. And this is an example here of how a zoning lot merger works. So we have a yellow lot slash building that is adjacent to a blue lot slash building, right? And so this image that you're seeing right now is the maximum that each of these sites can develop if they are just building their buildings separately, right? But if the yellow building is slightly underbuilt, then it has excess floor area or development rights that it can then transfer to the blue building. And the way that would look is like that, potentially, right? In order to get to this point, the owners have to file what's called a ZELDA, or a zoning lot disposition agreement, that basically outlines a new zoning lot and allows for those development rights to be transferred from the yellow site to the blue site. However, you could end up in a scenario where, for whatever reason, both of those sites are vacant and there's no development on them. The interesting thing about this is that the larger your site is, the more flexibility you have in terms of what you can develop. And so in this example, you could end up with a building that is much taller, right? Because you have more flexibility in terms of, in particular, the sky exposure plane. In this example, and this is just one iteration of what could happen, you've got a one-story base, so that is the base height of the building, whatever that is, and a tower above it. So I want to pause now. I don't know how many reactions that last slide elicited from folks. And I want to take some question and answers, or questions rather. I see we've got two. Mariama asks, has there been any thought as to what would be a healthy maximum of large nightclubs and or catering halls in a mixed use but densely populated residential heavy area? So I think this question will go into use groups. I can't say that I know off the top of my head what use group a large nightclub might fall under. So I would say first refer to the zoning resolution in terms of those uses, and also whether or not they are allowed in a particular zoning district that you're looking at. And I will say it's a bit out of my personal wheelhouse. Land use is not necessarily the division that deals with this, but in terms of the actual noxious part of those uses, there is a process by which community boards can evaluate, in particular, the liquor licenses that are granted to facilities, and that is a process that goes through the state of New York. So if there are concerns about sort of the noxiousness of those uses, and in particular them being close to residential areas, there is a process that is not necessarily a land use process that sort of deals with those concerns. Billy is asking about a commercial and residential and community facility example. What if it were just say residential and community facility? Does that change any of the number, or would the math be the same? So yeah, so you would still have the same, I can go back. You would still be looking at the same maximums here. So if you had a community facility, you would have, with a community facility, I should say, you would have a maximum FAR of 4.8. So you would end up with a 2.43 FAR for the residential, and the remainder could then go for community facility. I am not the savviest with math, but I'm sure someone, if not half of you out there, have already done that math. Vijay is asking, which FAR or zoning code takes precedent when you merge zoning lots? So in general, the zoning district that comprises the majority of that site is the one that you refer to in terms of what your bulk and FAR regulations are going to be. Where do you, Bruce is asking, where do you find the zoning codes for each block in Manhattan? So the map that that I showed earlier, the grayscale map that we had drawn over with the different colors for different uses, that map, if you can find it really on the Department of City Planning's website. I would also refer folks to Zola, which is a great tool that the Department of City Planning has really fine-tuned in the last couple of years, that will tell you what the zoning regulations are for any site in the city. It will give you a general sort of, it's a C42 district or it's an R8 district. And then there will be a hyperlink that will take you to a page on the Department of City Planning's website, and it will tell you what you can build and what the use regulations are for that particular zoning district. And we'll be sure to send that link to folks when we send both this slide deck and any additional information after the presentation. Seema is asking, what can be done about increasing public notice requirements for Zeldas? The cloak of secrecy for these surprises see these all the time. So yeah, I think this is one of the issues that has sort of come up, especially as we're seeing development that is as of right and yet still pretty surprising. There is no notice that is required when there is a change in a zoning lot. There is a proposed piece of proposed legislation before the City Council currently that would require a notice to the local community boards, the Speaker's office, as well as the borough president's office whenever there is a Zelda. But it has not moved. I think the first time it was introduced was maybe about 6 months ago. And to my knowledge, it has not moved from that point. There was a hearing at that point, and you know, it's definitely something that has come to the fore, like I said, as we've seen a lot of what folks believe to be out of context developments, especially in residential neighborhoods. Stacy asks, is there an approved list of environmental consultants that the city provides for seeker? If it's up to the developer, how are they vetted to be impartial? So I can't speak to whether there is an approved list, to be perfectly honest. But what I can say is that we talk about this in Land Use 101. The environmental review process is really something that happens in conjunction with the Department of City Planning. So the developer very much has the onus, yes, to hire the environmental consultant, but also has to present its draft scope, and it's we talk about the reasonable worst case scenario when we're talking about the environmental review process here in New York City. That very much has to be vetted and approved by the Department of City Planning. So there isn't really a whole lot of room for a developer just to say, well, we decided that there's no impact, and these are how we define the parameters, right? It is a much more iterative process that is meant to take to make it impartial in terms of just really meeting technical guidelines. Angela is asking if if the other two properties do not belong to the individual that is building, what happens to their FAR? Does the builder have to ask to use theirs? What if they wanted to develop their lot later? How does that work? I think, Angela, you're asking about the example here. Let me just read that question again. If Angela, if you could clarify your question, I'm not sure. I understand. So if you can clarify, there's still a few questions we have to get through. So if you can clarify, we'll get to it at the end of this question section. John is asking, once scope is defined, does the community board get to comment again? So yes, so the seeker process that we talked about in Land Use 101, I'll just go back to that slide. Sorry. So there is a scoping session that happens, right? There is a final scope, and then there is a public hearing that happens after that final scope is drafted. And again, a public hearing for the public to comment on a draft of the environmental impact statement. So there is tons of opportunity to comment, and as I alluded to before, it does happen in tandem with the ULURP process itself. What I've seen most frequently is that the public hearing on the draft environmental impact statement will happen at the same time that the City Planning Commission has its hearing on the application. And of course, that's part of the ULURP process itself. Wayne is asking for a split lot, what percentage threshold constitutes the majority use? I think yes, yeah, you answered the question there. More than 50%. There are yeah, that's essentially it. So if you are looking at the example that we had here, I'm not sure if the graphic will. Right, so in this example, this kind of lends itself pretty well. You see the yellow portion is just over half of the site, so that would be the majority of the site, and therefore those would be the, whatever rules are pursuant to that site, those would be the rules that you would end up following. Bruce Robertson is asking Zola. So yeah, Zola, like I said, is a tool that was developed. It's an online portal that provides information that was developed by the Department of City Planning. We will be sending the link to Zola at the end. I don't know if Aldrin, you're able to send it either in the comments to folks right now, but if not, we will certainly send it again when we send the slide deck to everyone after the presentation. Anne is asking if a commercial building wanted to switch to a mixed commercial / residential, what would they have to go through ULURP? Again, you would have to refer to the, sorry, I lost my spot here. You would have to refer to the zoning resolution and to the actual zoning district of that site. So if the site allows, sorry, what's the example? Yeah, if the site allows for residential use, then you can do it as of right. But if it is not in a residential district, then yes, you would have to either go through ULURP, or you would have to go through the Board of Standards and Appeals to request a variance on the use for that particular site. Wayne asks for a split lot, is there a threshold for the minority use that permits it to be used over the entire site? Wayne, can you clarify that question for me a bit? I'm not sure if you mean, yeah, if you could clarify that question, I'd appreciate it. I think we've still got some more, so if you enter it in the next few minutes, I think we will still have time to answer it before we move on in the presentation. April is asking, can you tell us the intro number of that bill? I don't know it by heart, but I will send that as well via email when we send the slide deck. John is asking, once a scope is defined, applicants often say it's beyond scope. Right, so there is a scoping process. And when we talk in Land Use 101, when we talk about scope, and we'll discuss it a little bit here, but not as much. So I'll take the time just to note now that there is a concept of certain requests being beyond scope. That's different from saying that the public can't chime in. But you know, as you are commenting on a particular application, you have to keep in mind that once the scope is defined, you know, any recommendations or requests that are coming either from elected officials or the community boards do have to sort of fit into those parameters. There is a small exception, which is that if there is time to study it, changes that are outside of scope can be made. However, those are few and far between from what I've seen, just because of the ULURP timeline itself does not allow a whole lot of time for a scope change to be studied sufficiently. Angela, I am going to reread your question one more time, and if not, I'm happy to discuss your question with you offline, and then of course share the explanation with folks as well. So I will say, in terms of the part of your question about the developer having to ask to use FAR. So FARs are transferred as part of a transaction. So they're essentially negotiated. If there is a developer that wants to build a site, and there's a site or more than one site that has unused FAR, then you have brokers who are essentially doing a real estate transaction at that point. And yeah, if someone wants to develop later, that's fine. I mean, it just would mean that the status quo would remain. There's no expiration once someone purchases TDRs. In fact, in some cases, people will do essentially a lot assemblage and purchase the transfer of development rights and hold the site for a period of time, and then resell it at a higher price to just basically turn over the site and get value out of it. I'm sorry, I am having trouble. Oh, there we go. My computer froze for a second. Wayne is asking, in the course of the Inwood rezoning, CB12's Land Use Committee commented that the seeker process does not adequately assess certain socioeconomic impacts. Are there any changes proposed to address this? So yes, again, I don't have intro numbers memorized, but I know that the public advocate in particular has a proposal for racial impacts of zoning actions and requirement that those be included as part of a analysis. I'm sorry, I keep losing my spot. So yeah, so that is one change that is proposed, and I think it is a conversation in particular as it pertains to the Inwood rezoning that is happening more and more frequently, because this is a land use action that is currently in litigation, right? And so one of the points of the lawsuit is that the analysis itself did not adequately assess the potential for displacement that would result from the development that would result from the land use, the rezoning overall. Barbara is saying, please remind me what the number means, such as R6. What does it mean when there are two numbers? So R in a district, or if we can go back. So again, when we're talking about districts, R is for residential, C is for commercial, and M is for manufacturing. The number that follows the letter is speaking to the intensity of that use. So in the example of residential districts, R1 through R5 districts are lower density residential districts, and R6 to R10, which is really the only ones you see in Manhattan. I think there's some R5, I wanna say in the Lower East Side. But other than that, most of Manhattan is R6 through R10, which is medium and high density residential districts. Angela, I think, had a comment about air and sun rights. If you have a question about that, let me know. Wayne is asking, is there a minimum percentage of the coverage governed by the minority land use that would permit a building to be built pursuant to that minority use as opposed to the majority use? For example, if say 40 or 45% of the site is residential, can the development be 100% residential? I think, okay, so you're talking about a site that is doing a zoning lot merger and you're doing a single development. You would be looking at the respective, again, like we did the example with the different FAR limits. So you would be looking at what the requirement is in that zoning district, and then building according to those limits. Tammy is asking, is there a specific committee on the city council that handles bills about zoning and land use? Yes, there is. We talk about it in Land Use 101. There is a general land use committee. It has 3 subcommittees, and I'm probably not going to remember all the names, but there's one that deals with landmarks, zoning and franchises, and of course there's a third one, and I'm blanking on the name. But yes, there is a land use committee with 3 subcommittees. It deals with a variety of land use and landmarks issues. David is asking, I understand that once a project is certified, its approval in ULURP is a foregone conclusion. Can you address this? Sure. So not always. It's just a mere fact that the vast majority of applications that become certified do make it through. I think anecdotally, what I will share is in the last, I would say maybe 6 months, our office has seen 2 applications in Manhattan that were certified and did not make it to approval, final ULURP approval. They were the Lenox Terrace application, which was, if anyone had been following, a very contentious application in Community Board 10. And that was withdrawn by the developer in the midst of a lot of community opposition, as well as opposition from elected officials. And there was also a much smaller application on the Upper West Side for a commercial overlay. Reverend Michelle is asking if the 4th model is approved and the building height is established, can the FAR be changed at a later time without approval? No, so the 4th model in this image here is the maximum FAR. So if you wanted to exceed that, or if you wanted something different from that, you would have to go through a ULURP, essentially, to rezone the site. So that is all the questions we have now. It says we've answered 19. So we will move along here to the next part of the presentation, incentive zoning. So there are a number of different mechanisms in the zoning resolution that allow for buildings to be built larger in exchange for providing some public goods. Those goods include public plazas, subway improvements, contribution to a district improvement fund. We have the Fresh program, which is for supermarkets in certain parts of the city. In Manhattan, it's really just upper Manhattan. And of course, we have inclusionary housing bonus as well. So just to go over the voluntary inclusionary housing program, this is really essentially follows the same formula as other mechanisms, right? You have a base FAR for a site, And then in exchange for providing affordable housing, you get a bonus, and that gives you your maximum FAR. It is not on a unit count basis. It is on square footage. So you're looking at 1.25 square feet for every square foot of affordable housing. And the units are required to be permanently affordable. You can have affordable housing on site, or you can have it off site. If you have it on site, you're looking at a single building with both affordable and market rate. If you have an off-site affordable component, you can either have it on 2 separate zoning lots and have it be affordable, one building be affordable and the other building have the market rate units. Or you can have them sort of at a greater distance from each other. The limit being that the development that is generating the bonus be no farther than a quarter mile or within the boundaries of that community board. And also just want to note that there is a sort of market for affordable floor area that allows developers to essentially buy affordable floor area and then build a 100% market rate building with the bonus that is generated by that affordable floor area. This map here is showing the areas that are eligible under not just the voluntary inclusionary program, but also the R10 program. It's an older program passed in 1987 that allows for a greater density in areas that are mapped R10 or the residential equivalent of an R10 district. And the map that sort of specifies in finer detail which areas of the city are eligible are found in Appendix F of the zoning resolution. And starting in 2016, of course, we have mandatory inclusionary housing. So this is a tool that allows developers, or I shouldn't say allow, that requires developers to provide permanent affordable housing. It applies in general when there is an increase in residential floor area. The rule of thumb here is just about 33%. If the residential floor area of a development is increased by a land use action by 33% or more, then MIH is what we call triggered, right? And so there are a number of options. In Manhattan, we're really looking at mainly 2. The first MIH option will get to an average of 60% AMI, whereas the second one has a 30% requirement of units be affordable, but the AMI is higher at 80% AMI. There are exemptions for buildings that are smaller. So if your development is 10 units and or 12,500 square feet of residential floor area, you can opt out of the requirement to build the affordable housing. There is a payment in lieu option as well for smaller sites. And also we want to talk, again, there's a land use 101 zoning and there is a landmarks 101 zoning. But I want to also go over the landmarks portion in this presentation as well. So the New York City Landmarks Law was passed in 1965. It gave the LPC its regulatory power, meaning that it can dictate what happens in a designated historic district or property. This is really the main idea behind the law is that historic preservation is a public purpose, and as such, the LPC is tasked with advancing that purpose. There were a number of legal arguments that tried to dismantle the law. In the landmarks training, we do talk about a couple of those cases, in both instances, the Supreme Court stated and then later reinforced their decision that governing over a historic property is not considered a regulatory taking. And that, again, that historic preservation is really a public benefit. A landmark is a building, a property, or object that has been designated by the LPC because it has special character or special historical or aesthetic interest or value as part of the development, heritage, or cultural characteristics of the city, state, or nation. So we're looking at 4 different kinds of landmarks that we have in the city of New York. You can either have an individual landmark. You can have a landmark that is an interior designation, usually something that's been accessible to the public. You have scenic landmarks, and of course we have historic districts as well. And when you're looking at a historic district, one thing to always keep in mind is that the zoning will still apply. So here we're sort of looking at layers of regulation that is imposed on these districts. So you have not just the zoning rules, but also the LPC requirements applying in these areas. However, there is some relief provided to these areas and individual landmarks through the zoning resolution, and in particular, special permits and the ability of individual landmarks to transfer their development rights. The special permits are in section 7400 of the zoning resolution. The ones that are particular to landmarks, I'll go over right now. 74711, this is one that is mostly used in Community Board 2 in Manhattan, and in particular in Soho. This allows for either an individual landmark or a building in a historic district to have modifications to the use and bulk requirements. It does not touch the FAR of that site. And in cases where you are dealing with a landmark, it does require that the applicant submit a continuing maintenance program that will show how the landmark will be maintained in perpetuity. Section 74712 is really more for parcels in historic districts that are either vacant or partially vacant. Again, this grants use and bulk modifications and does not have a change in the FAR. We also have a special permit under section 7479 that allows for the transfer of development rights from a historic landmark to a non-adjacent site. This provides for greater flexibility. You can transfer the development rights not just to an adjacent lot or through a zoning lot merger like we saw in the earlier example, but you can also transfer them across the street or to any site that shares an intersection with the landmark. Just talk a little bit about a slightly different example. In the special Midtown district, we have the theater sub-district. And the reason why, one of the main reasons why we have that sub-district is because of the need for theaters to really both be viable in the long term, but also to be able to change, you know, as often as they have to change their signage when they have a new show. So under the LPC guidelines, every time that a theater would change its signage to advertise a new show, they would have to go through the LPC. And so designating theaters in this special district was not really an option because of that hurdle. And so what the special Midtown district allows is for those theaters to be listed, to be preserved, and then to be able to still transfer their development rights within a decided geographical area. that will enable them to raise the funds to undertake capital improvements, but again, without having to go through the hurdles and apply to LPC every time they have to change signage. And I will stop there. I know those were two brief sections, and I will take a couple or a few questions from the Q&A. Dave is asking, all of Billionaires Row was tax abated. Where is there affordable housing? I will say, Dave, that I am not entirely familiar with all the tax benefits to which those developers have availed themselves. So when we're talking about bonuses in terms of zoning, it really is not, these are not mechanisms that are looking at property tax revenue. So it's a bit of a different wheelhouse. So I can't really speak to that in particular. Billy is saying, if a neighborhood with a high FAR limits rezoned to lower those limits with the goal of gaining leverage over developers to later demand MIH/affordable housing, would that survive legal review? Is it a taking? I will not opine on the legal review part, as I am not a lawyer, but I will say that there is no doubt in my mind, at least, that it would be tremendously contested. I will say in many neighborhoods where you have lower densities, in a lot of ways, what you have to think about in a holistic way, and my background before the BP's office is in Community Board 4, where there are some lower density residential areas, and there is a ton of sort of naturally occurring affordable housing in the form of rent stabilized housing. And so it's not always a zero sum equation to lower the density requirements in an area, and then say that as it gets developed, there will be negotiations for MIH and affordable housing to be included in those developments. So it's a very interesting question, but I do think that in this environment, and I will say even more in particular within the broader context of the administration really pushing for increased density to provide affordable housing, trying to do it the opposite way. Again, it's a very interesting question, but I think it's one that would have to pass muster with not just the development community, but communities that have been asking for higher density to get more affordable housing in the first place. Wayne is asking, does the option used for MIH take into account the local AMI? 60% AMI may better represent what is affordable in a specific neighborhood be significantly than 80% AMI. Who determines which MIH option is used? So AMI levels are sort of regional. The AMI in New York City does include a few other outside counties. I think ours definitely captures a part of Long Island, as well as the counties north of the Bronx. So this is a issue that is often brought up. What I will say is that when the City Council was reviewing the application for MIH, this was a common criticism that they received from advocates, from elected officials, from residents. And in response, in large part to those comments, they did make a modification to the application, and they added an additional option, which is a deep affordability option. And again, there's a trade-off that happens in MIH between the number of units that are required, or the percentage of units that are required to be affordable, and the AMI levels. And so the deep affordability option is a 40% AMI with only 20% of the units being affordable. So that is sort of an attempt to try to get to a deeper affordability that may be a need in some neighborhoods. And I would say definitely a need. If it's a need in some neighborhoods, it's a need throughout the city of New York as well. Tammy is asking, are there zoning and or land use rules or incentives that exist for affordable housing to be built alongside commercial uses in split buildings, i.e. hotels, or created as a part of a conversion? Not that I am familiar with. Yeah, I don't think so. I will double check, Tammy, and if there is, I will let everyone know. But really, when we're talking about MIH, for sure, that is really only triggered when there is additional residential floor area that is created. So I will let everyone know if there's a mechanism that works similarly with a commercial development. Joan is asking, does LPC requirement override the zoning rules? Not necessarily, really. I wouldn't think of it as landmarks and zoning rules, one taking precedent over the other. They're both really working in tandem. LPC has a set of requirements that pertain to the the improvement or the changes to a building or a historic district, and the zoning rules will tell you how much you can build, and again, the bulk and the shape of the building envelope. So I would say those two are rules that work in tandem as opposed to one sort of taking precedent over the other. Judith asks, how do school planning figure into this mix? When we're talking about schools and school seats, that's definitely something that is discussed as part of the CEQR process. So an application that is doing an environmental analysis would have to answer the question, how does this proposed land use action affect school seats in an area, and will there be a need for more? And if there is a need for more as a result of this action, how does the applicant propose to address it, right? So that's sort of the key part where schools sort of come into play. Tammy asks, what mechanisms exist to ensure that the affordable housing that was deferred has been actually built? For example, can a developer default on the promise of building the affordable housing or promise community benefits from one site and then still get building permits on a different development site? So the monitoring of affordable units is undertaken by the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, or HPD. There's a degree to which the Department of City Planning, I think, also has some involvement, but in terms of both the completion of the affordable units and the leasing of those units in perpetuity, the agency that we're talking about is HPD. And so I'm not familiar with any sort of rules as to what happens when it hasn't been built. I'm also not entirely, I don't know of any examples where that's been the outright case. It would be incumbent upon HPD to both note that the developer is not complying at any point, and then take action accordingly. I will say also that the Department of Buildings may also have a role. So the Department of Buildings does issue what we call a TCO and a CO, CO being the certificate of occupancy and the TCO being a temporary certificate of occupancy. And so for many, if not all, mechanisms that provide an FAR bonus in exchange for a public benefit, what you have there is an understanding that the DOB will not issue a TCO or a CO until they can certify that the benefit has been provided and that it's functioning and it's up and running, or whatever the applicable term may be. And at that point, and only at that point, can the developer then realize the operation of the market rate or other component of their development. So that's all the questions we have now. I'll move on, and anyone who has additional questions can enter them into the Q&A section. So we want to talk a little bit about special permits. Manhattan by far gets the most special permits that are granted pursuant to the zoning resolution. The special permits exist for special circumstances, right? There are situations where the standard zoning rules don't make the most sense. And so there's a little bit of a relief valve in the zoning in myriad different categories for those sites. They have several components. There are a set of conditions that have to be met in order for an applicant to even apply. And then in order to receive the permit, there are findings that have to be met. Again, so applicability, we'll talk about where a permit can be requested, which parts of the city, which zoning districts. Conditions, we'll talk about that initial threshold of criteria that has to be met to apply. The findings are what the project must meet in order to get that special permit. And there are two kinds. We talked about this earlier. The Board of Standards and Appeals grant special permits, as well as the City Planning Commission. The Community Board, of course, has a very important role in this. The applications are referred to the Community Board. We talked about this earlier. There's a draft scope that is submitted as part of the application. We really urge community boards to really hone in on that draft scope as they are evaluating the application. The findings, although they change depending on what special permit an applicant is seeking, there are some that are frequently cited in the zoning resolution. And they include neighborhood character, the impact of the proposed development on local services, circulation on the adjacent streets and sidewalks, as well as, again, the provision of light and air. So this is, like I said earlier, one of the major tenets of our zoning resolution. So to the extent that a community feels that there isn't sufficient light and air provided to the vicinity of a proposed development, we definitely urge folks to speak out, in that regard. I will also note, and actually there was a question earlier about scope and having a definitive scope. Our office and Gail in particular has always been a big proponent of having pre-ULURP or pre-planning discussions, right? And in many cases, some of the best applicants, and certainly when they come to our office, we always exhort them to talk to the community board and community stakeholders, because this really allows for parties who have interests or are neighbors in the community to really inform what the draft scope is going to be. And so the more discussion there is about all of these impacts that are listed out in the findings before the application is actually drafted and before the scope is finalized, the greater input and impact that a community board can have on an application. So I want to do a case study just to show an example of a special permit in the zoning resolution and how it would work. So this is the Whitney. The lot on which the building is built is an M15 district. so a high density manufacturing district. There are, of course, manufacturing uses allowed on the site, and there is a special permit provision that allows non-commercial art galleries and museums. The FAR for an M15 district, it's 0 for residential, 5 for commercial, 5 for manufacturing, and 6.5 for a community facility. The building itself is on a 36,000 square foot lot, and the size of the building is 232,000 square feet. So what is the FAR? Kudos to anyone out there who could do this in their head. I had to do it ahead of time and write it down. The FAR for this site is 6.44. As a community facility, which is what a museum falls under, it is in keeping with the FAR limits. However, it's not as of right because the use is not permitted in an M15 district. So enter section 74.921 of the zoning resolution, which allows both 3A and 4A uses in M1 districts. So I will read through this and skim through some parts, but I'm going to hit on all the elements that are common in a special permit. So this is what the zoning text itself reads. In M1 districts, except for houses of worship and ambulatory diagnostic or treatment healthcare facilities, the City Planning Commission may permit uses listed in use group 4A, community facilities, and in M15 districts, except in N15A, M15B, and N15M districts. The Commission may permit museums and non-commercial art galleries as listed in use group 3A, provided that such community facility is located not more than 400 feet from the boundary of a district where such facility is permitted as of right. So I'm going to stop there because that right there is the minimum threshold that an applicant has to meet to even apply for this special permit. So in this case, we are in an M15 district. The use that is being proposed is a use group 3A, and we are no more than 400 feet from the boundary of a district where a facility is permitted as of right. The second part is the findings that the City Planning Commission has to agree have been met. So the commission has to find that. Number one, that the proposed development allows for adequate separation from noise, traffic, and other adverse effects. Number two, that the proposed development draw minimum vehicular traffic through the streets that are around the proposed development, and that where applicable, number three, adequate reservoir space at the vehicular entrance as well as sufficient vehicular entrances be provided at the site. Number four, that due consideration be given to the proximity and adequacy of bus and rapid transit facilities. Number five, that there is no practical possibility of obtaining a site of adequate size located in a district where it is permitted as of right. And finally, number six, that the proposed development will not impair the essential character of the surrounding area. So those are our 6 findings. Going further, this particular special permit also allows bulk modifications to be provided. And again, these are the findings for the bulk modifications. That number one, they provide a better distribution of bulk in the zoning lot. Before I go into that, I should say that this part actually also includes a little tidbit there about a minimum threshold that has to be met. It applies only to M15 districts on a zoning lot over which the High Line passes. So this is a very particular piece of zoning here. So again, the findings have to be that there's a better distribution of bulk. Number two, that there's a better relationship of the building to the open areas, again, including the High Line. Number three, that there be adequate light and air, again, light and air, for buildings on the zoning lot, and as well as to surrounding properties. And number four, that the building contain a museum use that facilitates the public's use and enjoyment of the High Line. So this is another exemption that that Whitney can apply or did apply for and obtain, so long as they meet these four requirements. And finally, I want to talk about large-scale developments. So what is a large-scale development? So there are three types. They're defined in section 12-10 of the zoning resolution. They include residential, general, and community facility large-scale developments. In general, these allow for greater flexibility from the zoning resolution in exchange for some predictability. So you have to sign on to a site plan, and that site plan will limit what you can build, but also provide some flexibility. And there, the large-scale development areas themselves will have requirements, depending on what kind they are, requirements for how a minimum area that they have to be, as well as what kind of uses they have, and the ownership. A large-scale general development is found in section 7474 of the zoning resolution. These really are areas that try to have a uniformity in neighborhood character, and also allows for a mix of different uses. One example is the Riverside Center on the Upper West Side. A large-scale residential development, these rules are found in section 7800 of the zoning resolution. There are waivers that are granted either by authorization from the CPC or a special permit. And the most common examples that you'll see usually are NYCHA campuses throughout the city that are built pursuant to a large-scale residential development. And finally, we have large-scale community facility developments. These are in section 7900 of the zoning resolution. Most often, these are hospitals or educational campuses. One example is the Seward Park, Essex Street crossing development. There is a process for making changes to these special permits. And there are sort of three categories under which those applications would fall. The first would be an application that is considered to be substantially compliant with the existing rules of that development. This just requires staff level approval. And from that point, the plans can then be sent to the Department of Buildings to be filed. There are also minor modifications that can be made. This is also a staff level determination, but the application is also referred to the respective community board. And lastly, there is a major modification, most often either to the use, the bulk regulations, or if someone is trying to subdivide a LSRD, and this does require that the applicant go through ULURP. Sorry. So I'm gonna end there. I also just wanna note, in case it hasn't already come up in the Q&A section, our office is interestingly involved in a lawsuit currently over the Two Bridges development in Lower Manhattan. This is a development that would introduce 2.5 million square feet of development, as well as 2,500 units of housing. The applicant proposed and obtained approval from the City Planning Commission to pursue change to the special permit as a minor modification. And there's ongoing litigation, like I said, our office is involved in, that is basically arguing that no, this is a major modification, and it should go through ULURP. And just to end on an editorial note, to me, one of the ironies is that the ULURP process, we often talk about how long it can take and how it's, depending on how quickly different stakeholders and different, the City Planning Commission, our office, the Community Board, depending on how quickly each of those parties respond, and we're looking at about 7 to 9 months. The project itself, the Two Bridges project, has been in litigation for much longer than that at this point. So had they just gone through ULURP, but I'll end it there. And I will leave everyone with the contact information for everyone in our land use department. We each cover different areas of the borough. So you feel free to email me and or the respective planner for each of the districts. And I will head into the Q&A. Doug is asking, can you speak to the sometimes delicate balance between LPC approvals for renovations and ADA requirements? So yeah, this question came up in the Landmarks 101 zoning, and we can certainly send more information on that to some of these groups. I think we had someone in the last session on landmarks that really sort of, I think, put it well. My initial response is that when there is a change that has to happen to a designated landmark or a building in a historic district, that there is, it's not just, here's an application and the LPC evaluates it and says yes or no. There is a conversation that happens between the LPC and the owner. And I believe that one of the folks who had called into the last webinar had said that, if you're the owner of a landmark property or property in a historic district, and the ADA requirements really wouldn't work or balance well with the aesthetic of the building or the district, there are ways that the commission, and that they've seen projects that run the gamut, can make suggestions to meet ADA requirements while still trying to stay true to the historical appearance of a building and of a district. So it is I think you put it well, it's a very delicate balance, but it is a conversation that happens between the LPC and the applicant, and oftentimes, of course, the community board as well. Anne is asking, according to Tammy's question, what are the mechanisms to ensure that developers adhere to the stipulations to which they agreed? And what are the consequences if they don't, such as affordable housing, POPs, transit easements, and other community amenities? So, I mean, in cases where we find that folks are not adhering, like if a POPs is not remaining open, as it's, required to do so, and for the hours that it is required to remain open and accessible to the public, our office has had involvement, here and there with developers not complying with the public benefits that they've provided. Different agencies will be tasked with interfering based on what that public benefit is. I've not seen it personally get to the point where the developer refuses altogether. So we definitely, we want to hear, right? Our community boards are our eyes on the street. So we want to hear if there is non-compliance in terms of a public good that is being provided in exchange for anything for a developer. And we do follow up in those cases. And in most cases, although it's harder sometimes than other times, we work to get compliance. And I've not really seen a case where the answer is absolutely no. So I think that's a partial answer, but it is what my experience has been. David is asking, The owner of the terminal warehouse in the West Chelsea Historic District recently claimed that he couldn't reconstruct its historic parapets because they would violate current zoning. Would a special permit apply? Yeah, I mean, again, there's a special permit to obtain exemptions from bulk regulations, and so I would think I would have to look at the particulars of the terminal warehouse application. But yes, I do believe that they would be able to get a special permit to be able to build those parapets up to the height that you are suggesting, David. Tammy, excuse me, is asking, how would the information get from HPD to DOB if the certificate of occupancy has already been issued without the community benefit? What is the role of the city in ensuring that it is in compliance? I mean, first of all, city agencies, you know, they do speak to each other, and in an instance where we are involved, we definitely reach out to all the applicable city agencies to make them aware of the issue. In case of a TCO being granted, and if the site is under construction, one of the particular tools that the DOB can implement is called a stop work order. So that's one. If the building is already built, again, I would have to consult those agencies to really tell you what the remedy or the sanction may be in that case. But again, if there's a specific example, you know, we do work with community boards all the time, you know, who tell us about many different kinds of planning issues, and we do get involved. So please reach out if that is the case, and we will definitely see what we can do in that regard. Tammy's also asking, sometimes promises are made to the community who then passes a positive resolution, but the promises are not included in the final ULURP document. Can you clarify if there is an appeal process for the community? Yeah, I think this is sometimes the case. Sometimes ULURPs, especially larger actions, will have a points of agreement document that accompanies that ULURP document. I should also note, though, that even if you do have a points of agreement, you know, that is exactly, it's a funny name. It's a point of, we all agree that in exchange for this land use action or in conjunction with it, we will provide these things or do these things, but they're not necessarily binding. So, you know, community boards, again, we work with them very closely on these instances to really hold people accountable. When we do our land use 101 training, one of the points that we make is, you know, ULURP really doesn't end when you get city council approval. You know, and the community boards and our offices are also tasked with really holding people accountable and making sure that, you know, whatever a developer has committed to as part of a process, that they really adhere to those, you know, promises and agreements, whether they are documented or not. And so there is a lot of follow through that has to be done both by elected offices and by community boards. So it is an informal, perhaps part of the land use process, but it is a very vital one. Joan asks, can a site apply for several special permits? Absolutely. Yeah, we see ULURPs that have multiple asks, and sometimes there are different special permits that a site is asking for. Seema asks, how do you think NYCHA campuses will change given the capital/maintenance crisis that they face, even before the looming COVID-related fiscal crisis? What options do you think the city should explore on this front? So just before COVID, a few months before, the city of New York had put a plan out called NYCHA 2.0 that included 3 major sort of tools to try to improve and bring capital improvements as well as general operational improvements to NYCHA campuses. It included a transfer of development rights, a conversion to the rental assistant demonstration program, which essentially allows a different party to come in and take over management of the properties. And lastly, infill development as well. And so I think, a lot of things are up in the air in light of this pandemic and the financial repercussions of the pandemic in particular. But I think that there will be a greater sense of urgency to really providing some relief and some long overdue proper living conditions for folks who are living in NYCHA developments. And so, I think that there will be a greater focus on not just simply NYCHA 2.0, but really looking specifically as to how it will apply where. I think Gail and our office, we're not people who believe in a one-size-fits-all model for planning. And to that end, we were involved in conversations in particular regarding NYCHA developments in Chelsea, and really coming up with a solution there to raise capital funds and to have the buildings run better, that was both sort of inspired out of the NYCHA 2.0 plan, but that really was more responsive and appropriate for that particular community. So a NYCHA development in Chelsea is going to have different needs than a NYCHA development in Brownsville. And so those differences really have to be more fine-tuned than a toolbox with 3 different tools, in our opinion. So I think that will be an increasingly big conversation to have, and very much a long overdue one as well. Ken asks, did I hear correctly that the developers can buy their way out of providing affordable housing? Can you explain how this works? So no, what I was referring to is that a developer can purchase affordable housing in a particular site. I think we've seen this more recently in Riverside on the Upper West Side, where there is affordable housing, and then the developer will then purchase that affordable housing in exchange for having a building that has an FAR bonus, but that building then can be a 100% market rate building, where the already built affordable component is technically off-site. Julie is asking, there is some chatter regarding utilizing vacant hotels due to COVID-19 related interruptions to house the homeless population, and even for the city to acquire those hotel buildings and turning them into single occupancy rooms. Should there not be a land use review process? Whenever you ask our office if there should be a process and a room for community input, by and large, you're going to get, the answer being yes. Whether or not there is a requirement that it go through ULURP, I think that will depend on what zoning district these hotels are in, right? Hotels can be actually in, some hotels before 2017 could be built in M1 districts, but they can also be in commercial districts. So if you're talking about a residential conversion, then yes, you're looking at a ULURP. But at a bare minimum, I would think that yes, there should be some other process to really talk about that. And to the extent that it is a broader policy proposal out there, there certainly, I would expect there to be, and our office would definitely push for there to be a public comment component to that proposal. Shari asks, on the Upper East Side, there are no height levels on York, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Avenues, resulting in the building of super tall buildings. Is there any efforts by the city to change the zoning on those streets to impose height limits? So Shari, I can't answer what the Department of City Planning is working on necessarily. I can tell you sort of what is out there in the public realm. And to my knowledge, there are no current proposals from the Department of City Planning / City of New York to address either one of those avenues on the Upper East Side. Alita says there was a strong effort to have the Charter Commission Review Commission put forward a ballot proposal for a comprehensive plan for the city as the only way to require consideration of all aspects of urban quality of life in deciding where and what to build. It was not put forth. The zoning resolution alone isn't enough to plan for New York City. Is there anything pending that would provide such a plan with ample opportunity for public input so that residential displacement, affordable housing, neighborhood character are considered? So yeah, I think Alita, you're referring to a general plan for the city of New York that would then sort of be able allow planning to really put forth and incentivize the things that we deem to be whatever is deemed to be the most valuable, either affordable housing, open space, a mix of those things and other things that we want to see more of in our city. And you're right, it was not put on the ballot by the Charter Review Commission. And I'm not aware of any efforts to continue putting it forth, but I would imagine that with the looming election next year, that it will become a part of the host of planning issues that are discussed by folks who are running for office. So I would imagine, my speculation is that it will crop up again very soon. Rosa is asking, Howard Hughes is looking for a complex set of special permissions, air rights transfers, etc., to build a 1 million square foot tower at 250 Water Street in Community Board 1. However, they would be restricted to a 120-foot maximum building height with as-of-right zoning, which would be significantly less square footage on the lot. Do they, quote, require community board approval? So, Rosa, technically nothing requires community board approval. Even ULURPs that are referred to community board will take the community board recommendation as advisory. And in fact, if we're looking at the ULURP process, it goes community board, the borough president's office, the city planning commission, and the city council. And really the only one of those that is binding is the city council. And so, everything up until that point is advisory. However, as I've mentioned in the presentation, ULURPs and special permits are referred to the community board for comment. And as I said, I think in the Land Use 101 presentation, although the vote of the community board is advisory, there's a ton of soft power that can and is often exercised by community boards as part of that public review process. So we definitely also exercise that power, as well as an office that also has a recommendation that is non-binding. Mariama asks, has there been any increase or is one foreseen in the number of decisions made by LPC, DCP, etc., rather than going to the community boards? I'm not sure I understand the question. If you can clarify that one, Mariama, I'll answer it before we close out the presentation. If not, you can always talk to me offline as well. Wayne is asking, a developer purchasing existing affordable housing does not increase the number of affordable housing units available in a community. What is the benefit of this model? So it's not the purchase of existing affordable housing. It's that it is sort of there's a market, right? And so if you're, it's sort of the order of in which that happens, right? So you can have a development that builds at the same time that they're building their market rate building, they're building offsite affordable housing, and then what we're talking about is a model in which you have affordable housing that is built, and that there is now a market, and that developer is looking for someone to buy. So it's sort of a speculative thing that someone builds the affordable housing, right, and under the expectation that a developer who's seeking an FAR bonus will then purchase that affordable housing in exchange for the FAR bonus. Luisa is asking, going back to developers buying affordable housing built for another development to permit them to have 100% market rate, isn't that double dipping? So again, I think I answered that in the earlier question, but feel free to refine that question if you would like, and I will get to it before we close out. Doug asks, has there been any further discussion about removing the requirement for physical cultural establishment permits for gyms, so that smaller gym owners can compete with the larger gym companies that can afford the expensive and timely process to go through BSA in zones where they are not as of right? So this is a question that always comes up every time that there is a gym or a yoga studio or anything that falls within the definition of a physical culture establishment. It has to go before the BSA to get a special permit. This really sort of originates in the 1970s, in the sort of seedier days in New York City, where there was concern over what took place in some of these physical culture establishments. And so it is very much an outdated part of the zoning. The answer that we have gotten is from the Department of City Planning, at least in recent months, and they do get asked that question, you know, as you might imagine, pretty frequently, because community boards really, really, you know, in my experience, don't love having to go through these applications either. Is that the Department of City Planning is really trying to address this as they are looking at different parts of the zoning resolution. They've not yet, at least to my knowledge, come to a decision in which they want to wholesale remove this from the zoning resolution. They sort of deal with it as they're doing neighborhood rezonings and other actions that are of similar scale to that. I know that's probably not the most satisfying answer, Doug. You know, our office also gets a big packet every time there is a PCE application, and we definitely hear community boards who you know, express frustration, but also sometimes note that in some cases the gym is up and running and the application is submitted to the BSA as if that were not the case, and so it really begs the question, what is the point? So not too much great news on that front. Anne asks, didn't council member Kalos have a bill to put restrictions, to put height restrictions even in R10 areas, maybe on the grounds of contextual development? I'm not familiar with the bill that the council member may have in particularly in R10 areas. I do know that there is a piece of legislation that has been proposed. I will send that by Assembly Member Rosenthal at the state level that would essentially limit, I believe, that the height. It's been many months since I've had a look at it, so a little fuzzy on the details, but I believe it would limit the maximum FAR of buildings in residential districts. And it would be an amendment to the multiple dwelling law, which is why it is being proposed at the state level. Tammy is asking a follow-up question from the one that Mariama asks. She's trying to clarify that LPC staff making internal decisions and approvals versus community boards. I see. Okay. So yeah, there are. We did talk about this in the landmarks training. There are certain changes that can be made to landmark properties or buildings in historic districts, and some of those changes don't require a full hearing from the LPC or a referral to the community board. They're what the LPC would call very minor changes. I think if you're thinking about the physical appearance of those proposed changes, you would be limited to changes that are no bigger than 18 inches if seen from the street. So anything smaller than 18 inches, generally speaking, that's sort of the rule of thumb, can be approved at the staff level by LPC. I will, again, I don't want to speak on behalf of another city agency here, but I will note that, we did receive this concern from a couple of community boards, and in the earlier part of this year, and we did reach out to LPC initially, and what they were able to share with us is that, they were actually looking into the trends overall of applications that are submitted to LPC. More importantly, that they had noted in sort of preliminary analyses that the number of applications overall, whether they were staff level decisions or ones that required a public hearing and commission vote, that there was a decline, I think in over the last year, maybe two, in applications that were submitted to the LPC overall. Of course, the LPC is making more staff level decisions these days, because I believe in 2018, there was a rule change that introduced that 18-inch threshold. And so there are discussions and ongoing concerns from community boards, over, there are some things that are maybe being approved at the staff level that shouldn't be. And so our office is currently engaged in that conversation and seeking to sort of have a better understanding of what is getting approved at the staff level by LPC. So there's more to come on that for sure. And that's the last question we have. So I don't know if folks want to, I'm sorry, I think, is this a new question? Oh no, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry, it's a comment from Alita, or no, I think it's a question. We would like community input even for staff level decisions at landmarks. Do you support that? I think we're still at the level of finding out more information on what is being approved at the staff level, Alita. And pending a better understanding of that, our office and Gail will come to a position on what ought to happen. But I think in the meantime, we're very much engaged with trying to get an understanding of what has happened since there has been that rule change at the LPC. So I think that is all the questions and comments that I'm seeing. So I don't know if Aldrin, if you have any other notes you want to add before we close out.
No, again, I want to thank you. I want to thank Elka for providing the behind the scenes coordination as well and the registration. I want to thank all the attendees that stayed throughout the presentation. This webinar will be posted on our social media platforms and the PowerPoint shared at a later date. And for those of you who register for conflicts of interest, I look forward to seeing you in tomorrow's trainings. We have a 10 a.m. and a 6 p.m. one with the Conflicts of Interest Board. So that training is led by the Conflicts of Interest Board. And stay tuned to other offerings that we'll have throughout the summer. We're trying to get parliamentary procedure, Robert Rules of Order, resolution writing, as well as a special training with the Department of City Planning around the Statement of District Needs. So again, I want to thank Lisette Chaparro for your presentation and for answering all the questions, and thank all the attendees. Everyone have a good evening.